every train station has platforms, those wonderful structures used to board and deboard passengers. Elated because you never thought you'd hear someone call train platforms wonderful structures? Well, you're in the right place. But while it might seem it, platforms are not simple. The way platforms are designed, configured, and even operated has a huge impact on passenger flow, not to mention capacity, convenience, and accessibility. So do platforms right and you can move more people in more comfort through your stations. So let's talk about how. If you're new here, I'm Reese and this is RM Transit, a channel where we talk about the platforms people use to get on the trains. That's how you know we're serious. There's actually much to say, more than you might think, about this seemingly minor feature of a train station or even a tram stop. Platforms can be different heights, sometimes even in the same city. They can feature stores and other amenities, and you can even arrange a station and your transit route so that the platforms do the work of transferring passengers for you. I talked about that more in a previous video about cross-platform transfers. Of course, platforms come in many shapes and sizes, from 400-meter long platforms that can handle high-speed trains with 16 cars, to tiny on-street tram stop platforms that might just be 25 or 30 meters long. Width also varies widely. While that on-street tram stop I just talked about might just be a couple of meters wide, on the other hand, you might have a station like Lyon-Gru or Gare Centrale in Montreal that is extremely wide and spacious. At Gare Centrale, you can see a tactic that's used quite widely at different major stations where they transition from many routes running infrequently to a few running frequently. And that's filled in tracks to expand the space of the platform. And when a platform is wide enough, you can have all kinds of amenities right there, so people don't have to leave the platform to go get a coffee or a snack or even just fill up their water bottle. In Berlin and lots of cities in Europe, this is pretty common. And if platforms are openly accessible, they can also be used for things like bridging over gaps, whether that be a highway or a waterway. But how wide should a platform be? Well, obviously the number scales with passenger demand. Less than a few meters is a no-go for safety reasons. Even a quiet station can have a very busy platform if a busy train drops off a ton of people, and you need to have enough room for people to maneuver for accessibility reasons. A common number you'll see for an island platform at a very busy station is 10 meters wide. You can have narrower platforms at quieter stations as well, of course. Of course, older transit lines often don't meet these standards, and one of the worst examples I can think of for island platforms are the Clapham stations in London, while for side platforms there's a station in Bucharest with platforms that are only a little over a meter wide. It's probably worth noting that curved platforms, like ultra-narrow platforms, are generally avoided these days. That's because as cool as they are, curved platforms can lead to visibility issues as well as gaps between the train and the platform. That being said, they are still an option where absolutely necessary as long as they're sufficiently gentle, like at Berlin Main Station's upper level or at Tottenham Court Road on the Elizabeth line. Height might be the most important attribute for a platform, assuming your platform isn't super curvy or Clapham-style narrow. Like with rail gauge, platform heights tend to be standardized around the world, with high platforms being common on rapid transit and low being common for trams. Unfortunately though, unlike with rail gauge, there is more room to mess around with platform heights. And so it's all too common to see a big step up or sometimes even down at stations all around the world. If you can choose, I generally would say that high platforms are better than low platforms. Yes, falling onto the tracks is a risk, but being on the tracks is always a risk with a train system. Ultimately though, with high platforms you can use simpler, less expensive, and less maintenance-heavy train designs, which are also more accessible and higher capacity, because the high platform lets the floor of the train sit over as opposed to around the wheels and other equipment. Yes, you can have fully accessible low-floor trains, but they're a lot harder to design. The wheels also do have to go somewhere, so you tend to see internal steps, which means that only part of each train is fully accessible. For all passengers, level boarding and the platform train interface is really important. Level boarding is where you make sure there's no gap between the platform and the door sill on the train. And you also want to have a small horizontal gap so there's no risk of people falling in between the train and the platform, which is a real problem that does happen, though usually with children. Some trains even feature gap fillers that move out of the train to make the gap as small as possible. Sadly though, as projects like the Elizabeth line show, this is still not a universal thing even on brand new rail services. And unfortunately, there's something that's even worse for accessibility still kicking around, since level boarding can at least be managed with ramps. And that's high floor vehicles with low floor boarding. These are mostly going to be older tram-style vehicles, but they essentially force people to climb up a couple of steps to get into the main body of the carriage. That often makes them completely inaccessible, and so systems which still operate them tend to have a mixture of low-floor accessible trams and higher-floor inaccessible trams. But ultimately, like with so many things, the problems created aren't just for accessibility, since if people have to climb up stairs to get onto and off of the vehicle, well, it's going to slow boarding down and limit your potential frequency. One thing you will sometimes see in cities are mixed-height platforms. For example, in The Hague or Toronto or Karlsruhe. Mixed-height platforms can give you a level or close to level boarding experience with multiple different train heights. But of course, this is a post hoc measure that usually requires a longer platform. And it's a band-aid more than a solution. Having a widely used standard floor height, whether it be low or high, is the best practice, because it allows for less expensive rolling stock procurement, but also an improved level boarding experience over time for passengers. Now, so often on this channel, I talk about how to make transit successful. The right fares, the right routes, and a lot of frequency. But we don't talk enough about what to do when your system is already successful and it needs to move tons of people in and out of the city every single day. While getting people on transit tends to be a policy issue, getting more and more people on transit tends to be a technical one. Of course, there are many avenues to explore when it comes to expanding the capacity of a transit system. Bigger, longer vehicles, more routes, or more frequency. Providing more frequency means a lot of things. Enhanced signaling to allow trains to run closer together, better train and door designs that allow people to get on and off as quickly as possible, as well as, of course, better platforms that make sure people getting on a train don't block those getting off and vice versa. One common solution to enhance the frequency of trains that a platform can support is widening it to improve circulation. But with island platforms, this often isn't an option, since especially at busy underground stations, you can't typically move the tracks that the trains run on to widen the platform. One solution here can be lengthening the platform and then offsetting the train stopping positions, so that part of the platform is exclusively used for boarding trains in one direction or another. Another thing you'll often see is platforms that are shifted so that the transfer to another line can be placed as close as possible to the middle of the platform, allowing passengers to better distribute themselves along its length. I should note that while it's hardly common, London has expanded island platforms, such as at Bank, for example, by building an entirely new tunnel for the track and platform headed in one direction and then repurposing that original track and platform as more circulation space. But of course, that's a very expensive and complicated solution. With island platforms, a more common approach you'll see is where a transit agency converts an existing island platform into a side platform, and then adds another side platform to serve the other track, effectively giving you a two-side platform situation. Toronto has actually done this once at Union and is currently doing it again at Bloor Yonge, and I remember when I was in Tokyo seeing this type of approach used at tons of different stations. Platforms are often very busy, and so solutions have emerged to keep people safe while platforms are crowded. One of these that you'll actually see pretty often around the world are static barriers that sit in between the doors of a stopped train. This lets people fill up more of the platform without teetering over the edge without a barrier. The better modern version of this is of course the platform gate, or even better, full height platform screen doors, which I've made loads of videos on and are great for multiple reasons, from safety to accessibility, but also capacity. Of course, to fully realize this, you need platform doors which are responsive and open right when your train doors do, which isn't 100% universal. Otherwise, you're just creating another problem. When you have screen doors to separate trains from passengers, you can have the trains enter and depart the stations much faster, and you can also have them do so more consistently. Even better, you can create a natural queuing system where people can line up at the location where the door will be when the train stops. In fact, even if you don't have screen doors, you can place markers on the platform so that if your line already has the signaling technology that's necessary for precise station stopping, you can have people wait at the door locations. Speaking of markers on platforms, around the world you'll see all kinds of different methods to remind people to stay back from the platform edge, from brightly colored lines to tactile pavers. Something very cool that a couple of cities, such as Washington, D.C. and formerly Taipei, have done is include lights on the edge of the platform that remind passengers that the edge is there, but that also notify them when a train is approaching by blinking. But there's something that you don't see nearly enough, and that is dual platforms. Dual platforms are seemingly simple. They're just platforms which abut both sides of the train at once. While we often talk about adding more doors to trains, as cities in China show, there is a limit to how many doors you can cram onto the side of a train car. So then why not use both sides? This can effectively double the number of doors that passengers can use to get on and off of a train at a station, not only improving capacity, but also passenger flow. The amount of people that can use a door is often talked about in terms of flow, and a really wide door might be able to handle 3 flows or 3 people simultaneously using it, either to enter or exit. But the problem here is that when 3 people at a time can use a door, you inherently have an asymmetry, where either more people can get off than can get back on, or the reverse. And that means that dwell times are often going to grow. Fortunately, there is a solution. Now you might say, the Spanish solution, which sort of. A true Spanish solution is where you have one set of doors open slightly before the other. This maximizes passenger flow because people mostly exit through the doors that open first, which can of course be prompted by an announcement that tells you to exit on one side or the other before you enter the station. At the same time as passengers exit on one side, passengers are able to enter from the other, clearing out space in the train just to fill it back up, instead of having people head on and off at the same time through the same sets of doors and creating tons of congestion and head-on collisions. This is a particularly effective measure at stations like interchanges where there's a ton of passenger turnover. At the same time, this fixes the flow issue, because no matter how many people can use each one of your doors at a given time, you'll always have the same number of doors dedicated to boarding as to alighting. Now, having a design where one platform is dedicated to boarding and another is for alighting is not actually trivial. In a lot of subway stations and systems, people board and alight from the same platforms. And in these cities, planners and engineers might not be used to the idea that you have to have people enter on one platform and exit from another. And platforms for different lines need to be connected in a complex web of passageways that make sure that people aren't fed onto an exit platform. And in larger complexes where you want a proper Spanish solution, you not only need to think about how you connect up different platforms, but how passengers will flow from one train onto another. It's all worth it though, because as is kind of the golden rule of passenger transportation, one-directional flows are just far more efficient and easy to work with than bi-directional ones. But where can you actually find these dual boarding setups? Well, for one, Spain. Both Barcelona and Madrid have loads of stations with the Spanish solution. And that makes sense as both of these cities punch far above their weight with small trains and tons of passengers. But they're far from the only ones. Brussels actually has several, and all manner of different cities use the Spanish solution at 1 or 2 stations. Some cities will actually retrofit a Spanish solution or dual boarding in after the fact to expand capacity. As I talked about earlier in the video, to do this you generally need an island platform, lest you have to do a complete station rebuild. But where you do have an island platform, you can add a side platform or potentially 2 side platforms to implement a Spanish solution. And Vancouver, for example, actually did this a couple years ago at Commercial Broadway, where a new station platform was added to increase capacity for trains heading into the city center. And rumor has it that eventually the same thing will happen in the other direction. Being able to pretty simply retrofit this in is a nice benefit of elevated rail. You also tend to see a lot of terminals using the Spanish solution, in places where a line operates as a sort of shuttle, like Line 4A in Santiago, Chile, or the SRT, rest in peace, in Toronto. Covering over one track allows people to get on and off of a short line quite conveniently. And Mexico City quite widely uses a Spanish solution at its metro terminals, where you'll typically see 2 island platforms with a single track in the middle that can be used Spanish solution style, with one of the island platforms being for alighting and one being for boarding passengers. Of course, the coolest use of dual boarding is for extremely high traffic situations. One example of this is Sydney Olympic Park Station, which has enormous platforms around 2 tracks, which are on a one-directional loop back to the main line. This allows for huge numbers of passengers to board trains one after the other, allowing for the dispatch of massive crowds of concert goers or sports fans. The Munich S-Bahn is weirdly one of the only RER or S-Bahn systems to use dual boarding, but Munich also manages 30+ trains an hour through the Stammstrecke, so clearly something is working. All in all, platform design seems like a minor thing, but for transit advocates and practitioners, having a good sense for what is possible and the solution space is incredibly valuable, potentially helping us to find solutions where it may not be obvious and making our systems higher capacity, more convenient, and probably most importantly, more accessible. Thanks for watching.